So let's talk about thinking like a scientist. What exactly makes scientific thinking different than every other kind of thinking? It really amounts to two components. One is objectivity rather than subjectivity, and the second is systematic observation and repeatable evidence. And we'll talk a little bit about those in this brief video. So when we discuss objectivity over subjectivity, scientists typically strive to be as objective as possible. The problem is it's not easy to be objective. It's often really difficult to recognize when you're being subjective. So as a result, scientists tend to rely on some methods, called scientific methods, of course, that promote objectivity and do their best to sort of help prevent biased subjective observations from distorting their work. Science instead uses systematic observation rather than kind of a hit or miss observation. That is, in our day-to-day life, we go through life and recognize or observe all kinds of things. But those aren't necessarily scientific observation. Instead, we're making conclusions or at least helping form our opinions based on whatever is happening around us. And of course, there's all kinds of things that aren't necessarily happening around us, but contribute to scientific knowledge as well. The idea behind scientific knowledge is to take a very systematic, well thought through approach to understanding, in the case of psychology, how people behave. As I mentioned, this requires the reliance on observable and repeatable evidence. Everyday observation often ignores evidence, especially when it runs counter to our already strongly held beliefs. So as human beings, we typically have beliefs that help guide our lives. Some of them they're sort of tacit beliefs. They're beliefs that we don't even recognize that we hold. And those help interpret sort of what's going on in the world around us. But they also can bias us to what's going on around us and sort of blind us to actually understanding the world. The idea behind science is not to throw those ideas out completely, that is, kind of everyday observation, but instead to bring to bear a set of tools, again in the scientific method, that help us sort of tease out what those biases are and instead get to kind of the heart of what it is we're trying to study. So the fact that we can learn something new tomorrow that's not part of scientific knowledge today is pretty exciting, but it can also be a little frustrating, I think. The fact that we learned something new today doesn't mean that the knowledge is flawed, what we knew before is flawed. Instead, most changes tends to occur in science kind of at the cutting edges of science, not quickly at the main core of its knowledge base. And in fact, I think it's critical to recognize that scientific literacy itself includes learning to be comfortable with the idea that scientific knowledge will improve, and it's open to improvement and will never be considered absolutely certain. At best, even in science, what we're trying to do is make our best guesstimate of what's going on in the world around us and to make that sort of estimate replicable. That is, we can sort of reproduce it time and time again. A big part of scientific thinking is simply critical thinking. A critical thinker ends up learning how to follow logical arguments, identify mistakes in reasoning, prioritize their ideas according to the importance of that idea, apply logic to personal attitudes, beliefs, and values, and so forth. And really it amounts to sort of using 5 kinds of critical thinking questions to sort of evaluate any new information that you come across in your everyday life. So, for example, these are over here on the right-hand side. One of the first big questions we should be asking ourselves when sort of faced with new information that we didn't anticipate. One is, what am I being asked to believe or accept? The second is there actually evidence, and what evidence is there that supports this thing I'm being asked to accept? And third, I think, is a really critical one, especially for psychologists and other scientists. Are there other ways that the evidence I'm being shown could be interpreted? Are there other explanations for them, for example? Number 4, what other evidence would I need to even evaluate these alternatives? And 5, what are the most reasonable conclusions? But I think in our lives, we don't always, well, simply because they take time, we don't always sort of apply these kinds of thinking rules to what we're prompted with. As a result, even as a consumer, we end up buying things that we really don't need at times. We end up accepting political arguments, for example, that probably don't quite make sense when they're held up to these kinds of questions. And I think just as a college-educated and generally educated person, it makes sense to be able to take all of the thoughts that people and arguments that people try to present you and apply these kinds of critical thinking questions for them. It's part of being a good citizen, a good consumer, and frankly, an educated person. There are some signs that perhaps you are not thinking critically. Don't let these bother you too much. Believe me, we all fail to think critically from time to time. But here are a few. Instead of figuring out the answer to a problem yourself, you might prefer to just be given the answer. So, for example, we often get answers from people that we think are in authority, even when those answers are wrong. But by the same token, we tend to just accept what a person in authority says. That's not a great approach. And instead, we should be doing our best to sort of weigh all the evidence on our own. Second, you prefer to use gut feelings about decisions instead of using reason to choose a solution. And there have been plenty of cases where people have lost plenty of money and lost things that they shouldn't have, for example, simply by going by gut feelings instead of sort of thinking things through with those 5 questions. The next is you don't review your mistakes or change your mind if the evidence contradicts your original position. And it's really hard to actually change your mind, believe it or not. But it's also really critical, again, and it's part of being an educated human being. And then finally, another sort of dead giveaway for lack of critical thinking is that you resent criticism of your ideas. Ideas are not you necessarily. When somebody criticizes your ideas, it's important to recognize they're not criticizing you. They're criticizing some idea that you forwarded. And I think it's really critical to be able to take those criticisms and be able to even rethink your own approach to the ideas. That's part of learning.